Got it. All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm Ken Medlock, Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies here at the Baker Institute. Glad you could make it. I understand there's a bit of a debacle with traffic outside right now. So if you're not here and you're joining us online, welcome. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's a pleasure to host Rajiv Shah. He's the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. I would read his bio, but it's long and very impressive. I'll try to hit a few key sort of highlights. First of all, Rockefeller, it brings a data and science-based and innovation-based approach to solving some of the world's most difficult challenges and really just improving well-being for citizens around the planet. Raj actually was appointed the USAID administrator under President Obama in 2009, which I think all by itself suits him very well for this talk. But prior to that, he also wore many other hats that really provide not just a policy-oriented frame for the discussion we're going to have today, but also a very practical frame for the discussion that we're going to have today. So, Chief Scientist and Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, founded Latitude Capital, which focuses on power and infrastructure development, spent some time at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, focused on a program that really expanded the ability to immunize folks in less developed countries in particular. Transformative type of program, holds degrees from the University of Michigan, Pennsylvania School of Medicine, Wharton, very well-rounded, to say the least. He's also the recipient of the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, and he's the recipient of the U.S. Global Leadership Award. So I am going to step out of the way and hand the floor to Raj, and after he gives a few remarks, we're going to have a conversation, and please be ready to ask questions because we're going to go to you very quickly. So, Raj, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you here in person, and good afternoon for those of us joining online. It's just exciting to be here, and thank you, Ken, for that kind introduction and for your leadership. I mean, it's true that Rockefeller tries to bring science and data to our work. Ken, you've been doing that for quite a long time to yours and to this great institute. I also want to thank the institute team for having me here today. We're all long admirers of Secretary Baker's extraordinary career and service, so it's wonderful just to be in this building. I imagine all of you are well versed in the challenges we face, especially during CERA Week here in Houston, and in particular the challenges we face in transitioning our energy economy in the United States, around the rest of the industrial world, and certainly in developing and emerging markets. At Rockefeller, we have come to believe that accelerating the transition of the energy economy in developing countries and emerging economies is perhaps the single most important part of the global fight to maintain 1.5 degrees Celsius warming as a reality for our globe and avoid the disastrous outcome of ending up at 3 degrees Celsius warming. And I'll speak a little bit about why we believe that's the case. Part of why that is the case is a concept that I think has been recognized at the CERA conference. I was there earlier today, as well as with those of you here, which is energy is the means through which people experience human development. It's the means through which they improve fundamentally their living standards. And we have to tackle the challenge of transitioning energy economies in the developing and emerging world with a mindset that recognizes I would call it human right that billions of people have to improve their basic living standards through increasing their consumption of energy. So let's start with what's at stake. If the world continues with business as usual, our planet will likely warm at about 3 degrees Celsius. That's based on IEA estimates about current policy commitments and whether they are fully played out or not. But the bottom line is, if those current policy commitments, especially in OECD economies, are fully seen through, and we all know that you can't take for granted that comments made by political leaders are fully seen through, but if they were, we would by their estimate, be at about 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. The difference is actually quite dramatic. At 3 degrees, hundreds of millions of additional people would go undernourished, particularly in parts of the globe where food production would go down dramatically as a result of climate change. 47 times as many people in African cities, for example, would be exposed to dangerous heat compared to less than half that at 1.5 degrees. At 3 degrees, 1/3 of species across our planet would be at extraordinarily high risk of total extinction. So the stakes are extraordinary, and they're extraordinary for billions and billions of people. And we believe that outcome is a choice. Countries, major industrial ones like the United States, in Europe, including China, have made real policy commitments to transition their economies and their energy economies. And as we've been reminded of, I believe, all week, the Inflation Reduction Act alone will invest $370 billion in that transition right here in the United States. As a result, whether this fight for climate change is won or lost will actually depend primarily on what happens in developing and emerging economies and in their energy sectors. Today, in 81 countries that fit that characteristic, including India, not including China, there are 3.6 billion people, 3.6 billion people, half of the world's population, nearly half, who live without access to 1,000 kilowatt hours per year of energy consumption. That number we consider to be a modern energy minimum if you are to live productively in modern society. About 750 million of those people live without enough electricity to light a single light bulb and a small appliance all year. They are what the United Nations calls the energy poor. And that's been, in my view, unfortunately too narrow a focus for that term. But in fact, I have spent plenty of my time in communities where people consume at less than that level, about 150 kilowatt hours per year. And I can tell you what you know, which is at that level, it is extraordinarily difficult to escape the kind of extreme poverty that is characterized by hunger, disease, injustice, a lack of basic public safety and lighting that makes people deeply vulnerable and trapped in a cycle of extraordinary injustice. But that number also includes billions of people who live close to but not above the modern energy threshold. And for those populations, we now know that ineffective, expensive, and erratic access to energy, usually in the form of diesel backup to highly unproductive grid systems run by governments and public utilities, is actually the single greatest constraint to inclusive growth, to job creation, and to a better future in those settings. That's why, in part, South Africa has a 49% unemployment rate. Can't be a young person and be optimistic about your future if you live in an economy where half the people are fundamentally unemployed. So the real choice we face is not whether or not we need tremendous expansion of energy in the developing world, but how we achieve that basic objective. Now, everyone here knows how central energy is to your basic lifestyle. But I just want to highlight that in Texas, I think you pay, but experts here will tell me I'm wrong, about 13 cents a kilowatt hour on average for power statewide. Maybe in Houston, it's a bit higher than that. If you were in Nigeria, you would pay somewhere between 50 and 80 cents a kilowatt hour for power on average, because public grids produce energy in an erratic manner, and you'd be primarily getting electricity from diesel generation and backup systems that are just extraordinarily expensive. And 40% of that population, more than 40%, 92 million people, would be living under the 150 kilowatt hour threshold, effectively with no energy access or electricity access whatsoever. We can't expect our global economy to flourish in an environment where energy access is that constrained. It's why at the Rockefeller Foundation, we've made our single biggest priority bringing new renewable energy technologies to those communities in significant need. And we fundamentally believe that the renewable energy technology revolution offers the types of new solutions that can power communities that haven't previously had access. And I'd like to show you just a short sort of drone footage of one of the mini grids that we've installed in Bihar, a state in northern India. That's a small grid system, probably about 300 or 400 kilowatts in total. On the same grid platform on the left there, you'll see there's water and sanitation tied to it. This village is called Durni, and it's a community I had a chance to walk through. They get government grid supported power for, part of the day. And then usually around 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock, it sort of cuts out. And the backup grid, which is what these systems are, come into play and provide electricity for that community. And when we started kind of optimizing these systems a decade ago, the panels were hard to get, the batteries were expensive, the smart meters that we use to allow small communities and people in those communities to pay based on mobile payment, based on remote metering, were ineffective. All of those technologies improved dramatically over the last many years. And the total price of delivered power from these types of systems came down from 80 plus cents a kilowatt hour to now about 20 cents a kilowatt hour. And together with Rockefeller built the first 500-600 of these with a group of commercial partners, studied the impact on local businesses and local homes. We can probably, I think this will just run in a loop, so you can cut that off. But you can visit the shop owners in that community, whether they are, I visited a carpenter who said, look, before I had reliable power, I couldn't invest in power tools, was doing everything by hand. Now I have a thriving business. I've hired 3-4 people. We're growing. And that story gets replicated in shop after shop after shop. And that's the sort of economic uplift that comes with addressing and ending energy poverty in a community like that one in Bihar. The reality is these types of systems, actually just this afternoon, we had outreach from the president of Zambia who said, we want all these systems you're rolling out in India in Zambia because we think it's the best way to reach our rural and difficult to reach communities with power and electrification. The reality is, despite the big progress we're making in making renewables a larger share of the mix around the world, very, very, very little of that is actually going into developing and emerging economies. In fact, in 2021, only 6% of total solar PV and wind additions occurred in the world's 81 energy poor countries, and only 0.6% of the total was in Africa. And there are two basic challenges that make this difficult outcome a consistent reality. One is cost. Developers in these environments, some of you I'm sure are quite familiar, will pay 3 times as much for batteries if they can even get access to them, and pay 20 to 30% as much for solar PV if they can even get access in that context. The other reason is the lack of available financing. In almost every country in the world that has built out universal electrification, we've done it through strong public and private sources of financing at scale. In the context in the developing world today, with respect to this particular challenge, there is extraordinarily little actual public finance available to pay for this transition. And private sources of commercial finance demand returns that are far in excess of what most of these projects are going to be able to deliver for a variety of reasons. So as a result, it's not happening on its own. As about 18 months ago, the Rockefeller Foundation partnered with some other philanthropic organizations, the Bezos Earth Fund and the IKEA Foundation, and created a $1.5 billion grant pool to accelerate the implementation of these projects. That led to another $10 billion of commitments from development banks and development finance institutions. And we launched an entity called the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, with the goal of, in these nations, dramatically accelerating the energy transition and ultimately ending energy poverty. The Alliance's 19 partners, already active in nearly 24 countries, helping to develop more ambitious plans, helping to identify where solar and wind and battery technologies can be deployed more effectively to deliver on the vision we've set, and has already started to achieve some success. I'll give you a couple of examples. First, By pooling procurement across developers and with countries, we've been able to lower the cost of actual technology access for local developers. In just one example, our DART, I'm not sure exactly, I'm not remembering what the acronym stands for, but it's a pooled procurement mechanism in Nigeria, has brought down the CapEx for solar projects by 30% for developers that join that portfolio, because pooling gives you scale, scale gives you access, and it allows us to support efforts to expand renewables in that context. Our vision for that effort is actually far in excess of just what's happening in Nigeria. Our goal is to have partners in all 81 countries come together and have the option to procure via pooled procurement mechanisms so that they could dramatically lower costs and dramatically accelerate technology access in these settings. Another example is around technology. One of our big priorities going forward is to help nations put more energy storage on the grid so that the marginal cost and the marginal benefit of incremental additions of new generation tip in the favor of renewables from fossil fuels. One example of that is in Malawi. We're putting grid storage in place for the grid in Malawi so they can have more wind and solar as a way to power the grid of the future, and doing that by helping to finance the installation of batteries that would effectively be somewhere around 15% of the total installed capacity of the Malawi grid. Small country, small grid, relatively low total peak capacity, but once we implement that over the next 18 months, it'll be the largest penetration of energy storage on any grid system in a developing economy. So with this effort, a third example actually is also important, which is just policy support and engagement for countries themselves. Frankly, when you do this work, you realize that nations need support just to implement policies that can help unlock the market, whether it's a subsidy fund to help defray the capex of the solar mini grids, which we've helped establish in India and Nigeria, whether it's a project to expand access to irrigation via power in Ethiopia to reach 25,000 farmers and give them the capacity to use productive power to improve their agriculture, or in South Africa, where we helped a global effort called the Just Energy Transition Partnership to decommission a coal plant, Komati, and to replace that with renewables. Our role was to help support the government being able to make that transition and to invest in training and creation of green jobs as it relates to their own objective for how to be successful with that. These types of efforts in country after country can in fact accelerate the implementation of these efforts and these technologies. And we think at the end of the day, that acceleration, if it prevents developing countries from being the source of 70% of the world's carbon emissions in 2050, which is what they would be if we stay on our current path, is both a solution to the extreme consequences of failing to address climate change, and perhaps the best chance we have and have had in decades to give people who live in communities like the one you saw in Durnie a chance to actually lift themselves up through their own ingenuity and enterprise. So with that, thank you for having me here, and I look forward to your comments and thoughts as we go forward here. Ken, where do we go? Here? Okay, great.
Sit on that side.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, fantastic framing. I wrote down enough for us to spend the next 3 hours actually talking about things. So I'm just going to kind of kick it off with a general remark and then dive into a few questions, and hopefully all of you in the audience will come up with some questions as well. First of all, I was really glad to hear you talk about the energy minimum, because a lot of times the discussion of energy poverty does focus really on the lowest possible threshold, and that really is that's not anywhere near sufficient to promote growth and development, improvement of welfare. Access to energy is so incredibly important, and it's not just so we can turn on the lights and have meetings like this and speak over mics and all that stuff. It's also much more basic. So if you think about areas that have no access to energy, that also means they don't have running water, they don't have sanitation services, they don't have access to refrigeration services, which are critical for vaccines and medicines and other things. So so many different levels this impacts welfare. There's a couple of things though that I want to kind of dive into. You mentioned you spoke at CERAWeek this morning,
yes.
right? And it's been interesting to see the evolution of the discussion around energy really drive us to a different place than we were just 14 months ago. Largely, you think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There were a lot of folks that were talking about energy poverty before that in the context of promoting economic development and welfare. But there was also denial of access to financing for certain types of things that could actually help propel and mitigate these situations in different countries. But energy security has now risen so high in the pecking order with regard to what is going on. One of the things I noticed at CERAWeek, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this because I think it speaks directly to what you just addressed. There seems to be two parallel conversations going on, but they're not merging for some reason. One is focused on energy security and the other is focused on energy transitions. And there's some attempt to kind of bridge the gap between the two. But it's remarkable because we've actually done work with groups like Africa 50, the Africa Development Bank, and they talk about access to energy because it's definitely a world of haves and have-nots, but they also talk about access to finance. They talk about what it will actually take to improve the welfare of the citizens under their purview. And when you look at the conversation in the developed world, it's very disconnected from what's going on in the developing world. So I wonder if you could just give me your thoughts on that. There's a lot in that.
I have a lot of thoughts on that, and they're a little bit long, but they're all in the spirit of it is way too disconnected. Yeah. We're making a $370 billion investment of public finance to transition the American energy economy. And basically there's been no effort at all to support meaningful public finance to enable those transitions in developing and emerging economies. In 2009 in Copenhagen at the climate meeting, there was a commitment to create a $100 billion climate mitigation and adaptation fund that in theory would have provided some finance for that. 13, 14 years later, that has yet to materialize at that level. So, there's a lot of reason to be skeptical that what countries are willing to do in their own economies, we don't seem to be able to muster the global cooperation to do in the rest of the world where it's necessary. COVID's made that much worse. So if you actually look at how economies responded to COVID, the wealthiest industrial countries put 25 to 30% of GDP into their economies for a variety of reasons through a broad range of instruments. Large emerging economies did about 6%, and most less developed nations did about 2%. And you've just seen a big economic divergence in terms of the human development outcomes since then. So I think finance is a huge gap. We believe any new solution has to really be driven by an understanding that it's not 1958 and you sort of need public-private partnerships and instruments that deliver real leverage. And as opposed to just straight public finance that's not tied to creating incentives for private investment, or as opposed to expecting private investment to go into Malawi and pay for batteries on the grid system. That's never going to happen. And so, and I could get into that in more detail as to why, but I suspect you know. So to me, the finance piece is probably the biggest area where there's this huge divergence. And that's driven by, bigger geopolitical challenges we face right now.
So to that point, because I want to pull on that thread in particular a little bit, you mentioned near the end of your remarks the role for policy to support, this transformation that is required, particularly in the developing world. You mentioned subsidies. You mentioned effectively things that trigger demand for energy in ways that provide scale, that allow investors to go in with confidence that there's going to be offtake. But one thing you didn't really dive into was market design. And that is a really critical aspect of de-risking investments by the private sector. I think you're absolutely right. The public-private partnerships, particularly when you're trying to de-risk and promote those initial steps, is incredibly important. How deeply does Rockefeller and other groups that you've been involved with get into that market design aspect?
Well, our Global Energy Alliance gets into that very deeply in the countries we work, because the regulatory framework is the defining feature of whether you can have public-private project investment in those nations. I'd go a step further and say, I think we have to go beyond that. So, for example, the thing I'm most excited about, and if there are experts here or online that can help us with this, I want to invite you to help us with it, is that we believe there needs to be a major global push to allow for energy storage and other grid-based improvements to be a public good or a public investment priority, so that the next generation of new generation capacity around the world can come from renewables. And for that to happen, we may have to install, gigawatts of energy storage onto the grid systems of low-income and emerging economies in an environment where batteries are hard to access. There's a lot of competition. The supply chains are tight and tough, and the manufacturing base is not very distributed and resilient. And I've been thankfully a part of other efforts, whether it was bringing antiretroviral drugs to Africa, 15, 20 years ago, or dramatically expanding childhood vaccinations around the world, as you mentioned in your kind introduction, where basically someone stepped in and created a market for a sort of high volume, low cost manufacturing base to reach developing and emerging economies. President Bush basically did that when he created this PEPFAR program to bring antiretroviral AIDS drugs to Africa. Before, there was been no market, a very disjointed market. Any African country could only buy so much and could get it at very high price points. By aggregating the market and supplementing and helping to finance the procurement, they unlocked a tremendous amount of global supply, lowered the price dramatically, and just changed what was possible, and frankly saved 25 million lives on that continent over a decade and a half. A similar effort happened with vaccinations. If, in 1999, you basically could, if you were in Malawi or Senegal or parts of India, you basically couldn't get access to the vaccinations you needed for childhood immunization for a variety of reasons. To create that market, this entity called the Global Alliance for Vaccines aggregated demand across 70 countries, took some risk, went out and told manufacturers, we will help pay for the acquisition of huge volumes of vaccines for partners who didn't really know they had the capacity to deliver them at the time, but in doing so created a manufacturing base and a supply base. Over 20 years, 900 million kids have been immunized and 10 million lives have been saved. It's not the same exact thing in this industry, but there's an absolute need for thinking at scale and mechanisms that allow the market to function in a much more aggregated manner.
So I like the idea of demand aggregation, and this is a conversation that I've had with multiple other folks, particularly like when it comes to small modular nuclear reactors, which we were talking about earlier today, right? Same kind of idea, but the energy space is much more capital intensive. Yeah. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on the prospectivity for that type of mechanism to work successfully in this space.
Well, we're building the mechanism in energy storage to do exactly that. So I sure hope it works. It's our largest single investment. Yeah. We're going to make it work. I mean, in reality, look, at the end of the day, a few $100 billion feels like an insurmountable sum sitting here in this setting. But in a broader context, there's 6 multilateral development banks created basically after World War II. And if you move the way they handle their balance sheet from kind of 1970s into the 2000s, you would generate about that much liquidity for these countries. And that liquidity could then be deployed in more creative instruments to do something like this. Now, we're fortunate that President Macron and of France and a group of heads of state from around the world are gathering in Paris in June to try to do something exactly like that. And look, global geopolitics is hard. It's tough to get stuff done. But if we don't aspire to do big things, we'll fail before we even get started.
Sure, absolutely. So you talked about, and the drone footage, that was a fantastic demonstration of what has been done and the transformation it's actually made possible. Providing power in sort of residential and small commercial type applications is one thing, but if we want to get to the discussion about economic development and industrial sort of applications, where does what you're talking about fit? Because you really focused on microgrids and sort of rural communities, but
well, I think that's a great question. The answer is I don't entirely know. I think you need to have a mix of energy sources on grid, as everyone here I suspect knows, in order to have the ability to match the need for big industrial loads. Certainly in Africa and other emerging economies around the world, it's pretty commonplace to have dedicated generation for large industrial projects and companies and manufacturing efforts. So that's not surprising. At the same time, and we should have that. We're certainly not against that. We're not against gas being part of the solution in an all of the above sort of approach. But if you look at the fundamental needs of people at 1,000 and below 1,000, which is not a small group, 3.6 billion people is a lot of people.
Yes.
Their fundamental needs, small businesses that create jobs, which is the engine of job creation here in the United States and all around the world, their homes, their businesses, their communities, that can be met by new renewable energy technologies, using systems that take advantage of storage, that take advantage of new smart metering, that allow for mobile payment and remote management. And they shouldn't have to be dependent on government grids tied to large coal plants that are far away.
Sure. I mean, I would actually even, and this goes back to something we were discussing earlier, if you have those small grids develop as new technologies come to fruition, you can actually integrate them much more easily as well. So
and in a world that should value increasingly resilience,
right, exactly.
That's a vision of the future that's far more resilient.
So before I turn to the audience, I'm going to ask a question that's a little out of left field, but you did talk about the risks of climate change. And one of the things that I and several of my colleagues, looking at one of them right now, are doing here at Rice is looking at the role of nature to provide carbon sinks and sequestration options, and even quite frankly in some places around the world, real business opportunities. So how do you look at that? How does Rockefeller look at that? I think that would be informative just generally.
Yeah, we have a pretty significant food and agriculture program that's both in the US and around the world. And we've invested in efforts to look at regenerative agriculture systems and the economics of those systems and the capacity to sequester carbon and offset emissions in the food and land use space. And that's one example of kind of natural assets being compensated for doing the work of enabling more sustainable futures. And it's perhaps, and you're probably more expert than me, so tell me I'm wrong on this one, but it seems to be, of the options that are out there, the area that's most ripe for creating the economic incentives so that producers can shift their production systems to more regenerative practices. Certainly we work with a group of the 25 largest food and agriculture companies that are making commitments to have 50% of their value chain by a certain date be in regenerative practices. I think there's a lot of need for science and measurement and understanding how to optimize those practices so you don't get the dispersion that you see today in outcomes in terms of carbon sequestration, just to name one measure effect. Measurement
is critical. It's the next big industry, by the way, for anybody who's curious, right? But being able to measure and verify what's happening, is incredibly important. So I want to turn it to the crowd. So if you've got a question, please throw up your hand and speak loudly. Introduce yourself and speak up.
Terry Thorne. One of the things you didn't mention is training the workforce to install and maintain these new facilities in the rural areas. I've worked in developing countries, and oftentimes you can come back after a project 2 or 3 years and find out it's not working. It's been allowed to maintenance. So in that village you show, were you able to bring young men and women and create a new job category here and give them the training to maintain?
Well, I first let me just say thank you. Thank you for your work in these settings, and thanks for the question. We partner with operating partners that do that. So in India, for example, after the success of the first pilot efforts, we crafted, we entered into a joint venture with Tata Power. They are rolling out 10,000 of these mini grids, seeking to reach 25 million people and running that as a commercial business. Albeit with returns that make sense if you're Tata and you're accessing capital in rupees, and you have that installed management capacity throughout the country. The same is true in Africa. That we don't just build these as nonprofit projects and then walk away. That we have commercial operators that are the JV partners that build them out. And in Nigeria, we're building 10,000. In Ethiopia, we're building them out with agricultural and farming groups that want access to irrigation. And these pumps will be a big part of the demand sink that comes out of them.
Yeah.
Thank you for your comments. A lot to think about. Given that the Global South is really the laboratory for this century, and hopefully we're not using 19th century hammers on 21st century nails. A little more about agriculture. Working on CCS a few years ago, I became convinced that biology is going to be a big part of the solution. Can you talk a little bit about changing agricultural practices that will result in better nutrition and better water stewardship? Thanks.
Sure. Well, a lot of what our work is focused on are regenerative agriculture practices that tie to measures of soil health. And it sounds like you perhaps have a lot of expertise in this area, but the soil health is then kind of so tightly correlated with both carbon sequestration and water management and resource stewardship that we really believe that that's at least one super important indicator going forward. And we've invested in efforts with others to do soil health mapping on both global scale using technology ranging from on the ground to satellite, as well as locally to enable individual producers to make transitions and get compensated for the value they're creating. Right now, I believe that the sort of big demand signal for that transition probably needs to come from big buyers, big food companies that are willing to make the commitment to that and then help work with us to create the standards and the science so that it's transparent, legitimate, and consistent across the board. But that's a lot of what we're trying to do there.
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Samantha, and I'm a student here. My question would be, whenever projects like these go to like underdeveloped communities or like communities that are impacted by these like climate change issues, I know that there usually is a lot of resistance by the local communities. Like, for example, by building like these solar panels, sometimes the air quality is affected. There's a drain on water resources associated with the building of this. So I just want to like gain your insight on like how you managed to mitigate all these issues.
It's a good question. I don't know that we fully mitigate all those issues. I think at the end of the day, right now, you just simply don't have a lot of local production of the very critical renewable energy technologies necessary. So right now, if you look across our 19 partners in this Global Energy Alliance and their actual renewables project pipeline, projects are held up because solar PV panels sit in customs ports, and they're held up because wind turbines sit in those same spots, or because no one can access the energy storage technology they need at a price that's at all effective, and they're all trying to do so independently as effectively without any market power. So one of the solutions we think to the market is creating a much more distributed and much more geographically distributed sort of manufacturing base for renewable energy technologies. And I don't have a lot to say about how you do that in a way that is high stewardship. It's something we'll try to learn more about, but thank you.
So I want to turn to, we have several questions coming in online, and there's one that kind of speaks to the finance issue, and I think it's actually really intriguing. But how is the Rockefeller Foundation leveraging the existing relationships and experience of microfinance institutions around the world to hear about needs from middle and working class people and to deliver solutions to them?
Well, it's a great question. The microfinance movement, over 20 years showed people a few truths that I think people didn't appreciate or understand or just ignored. First is that lower income people, especially women, were incredibly creditworthy, even though the kind of original mindset is if you're going to make a loan, it should be to a wealthy man as opposed to a less wealthy woman. And so that got turned on its head because the data is so extraordinarily powerful that these incredibly hardworking women, providing 70% of total farm labor in emerging economies, for example, were excellent credit risks, paid back their loans in these different kinds of settings, and allowed for the whole industry to be commercially viable. The second is that technology can be transformational in the context of making small transactions economically productive. So you could make a small loan, get a repayment, do credit scoring. All of that could be enabled by the mobile phones that are ubiquitous and are far lower transactions cost than the way a bank worked. Both of those, and then third, you could run the business remotely, right, with the same technology. And so all three of those principles are critical to just the example I gave of the mini grid. Those only work because their customers are usually small businesses. Most of the productive loads are local small businesses, and those small businesses are often women, and they pay their bills, and so it works. In our projects, we had 97% total payment rates, which were far higher than what anyone thought you could achieve selling relatively expensive power in relatively poor communities. Second, we introduced smart meters together with a few companies that innovated those metering technologies. That made a huge difference. Smart metering and mobile pay were the technologies that really allowed for it to be much more expansive and accessible. And third, most of those systems are now managed remotely. So you don't have Tata doesn't place dozens of people into villages to manage these things. They're able to do that remotely. So I think there's a lot of learning from the microfinance industry that shows you can actually create commercially viable products that serve basic needs throughout the world, and that's got to be a path forward in the energy space.
Thank you. So I want to be mindful of time because I know that you do have a hard stop. So I'm going to ask a question that's actually coming from one of our viewers from Cape Town, South Africa. So thank you for being with us, Erican. What past experiences give you hope that this sort of massive effort on climate change can be successful?
Well, I love the question. I think there are a few past experiences. One is we've solved big problems before. Like when we started working on vaccines in 2000, it's not like we could sit around and say, okay, this is going to be easy. We had to really put a lot of effort analytically, financially, operationally across dozens of countries to say, okay, what would it take to create a manufacturing base that could provide hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines that were not currently manufactured at a super low price point? And what would it take country by country by country to have leaders commit to protecting the health of their children through safe vaccination? And that took a long time, but when it came together, it really did transform the nature of child health and welfare in a pretty fundamental way. The same is true in HIV. The same has been true in other areas where we've done big things together. So I don't believe this will happen right away, but if more leaders see that equitable access to renewable energy and that renewable energy technologies can be applied in innovative ways to reach the 3.6 billion people that we've been talking about, over time, you'll get the ingenuity and the political commitment and the financing to actually solve that problem at scale. And when we do, we'll avoid the 3-degree outcome. And when we do, we'll avoid the reality that hundreds of millions, billions of people still live in poverty because they can't do what all of us just take for granted, which is pay very little for totally reliable electricity and use that reality as the basis to create jobs and live in a vibrant economy.
Thank you. everybody join me in thanking Raj for being here today.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.